potentially. And now you get hit with great news. Nothing's happening in Palestine and Israel, but you've got what most people didn't believe they would see, even maybe in their lifetime. I was talking to a fellow who's 20 years younger than I am, from the Muslim world, but who's an American citizen, runs major projects for a major American think tank. And he said to me, would you think in our lifetime, putting his lifetime in the same time frame as mine, okay? There's some reason for him to do it, since I've announced that I intend to live to about 100. And then I will be raptured. It's going to be a very comfortable transition. Very comfortable, very cushy. And I'm working on this with a number of religious friends. We're all going to go up together. But the fact that he would say that, somebody who's only in his 40s and who deals with democracy in these parts of the world, who runs and develops schools in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and reforms, gets involved in madrasa reform, etc., says what a remarkable time this is. But because of the very nature of the governments, and because of the very nature of the support we've given those governments, we actually have contributed to a culture which is going to make things dicier in terms of moving forward. In other words, you've had cultures of authoritarianism, so how you move forward is difficult. How you who've been in opposition now come in and you come to accept the notion of a loyal opposition rather than crush it. I mean, if the forces of democracy come into power in some of these countries, what's the first thing you want to do? You want to clean up the military and you want to clean up your police because they represent the old order. But you can't do it the way we did in Iraq, try to get rid of all of them, because now you're just going to make the situation more unstable. So it's going to take national unity moving forward. The very folks that are involved in these movements that don't have clear leaders are going to have to, whatever their difference is, in the name of national unity, learn to move forward in terms of a system that in fact is pluralistic, is multi-party, is not simply vindictive in the way that former regimes were. Now with people in the old regime, there's going to have to be a real sense of justice in terms of what happens to people in the old regime, rather than saying, well, we're just now going to do what they did to us. We're going to round them all up, throw them in prison. That's going to be a real challenge. And for the United States and for Europe, it's going to be a real challenge to change its outlook on that part of the world, to accept this kind of transition. And we're going to have to accept it in so many different ways. Think about it. Most people will project, I just saw Warren Buffett interview today, and in fact most people will project that in 50 years, maybe before, we're going to have to accept the fact that we're not the economic power that we thought we were. We may still have a lot of power because we're going to have this humongous military power, but we're not going to be seen as economic and political power. But to then function, to handle that kind of transition, and to function and then dealing with other parts of the world where we're not only feeling challenged by China and India, but we're also feeling that we've got to deal in terms of our interests with situations that are not as easily and predictable with some of these governments is going to be a real challenge. But that's where we come in. It is our job as voters to be more informed and to make sure when we vote in the next presidential elections and the next congressional elections that we are fully informed and vote for the kind of people that we need in there, who, in a very dicey situation, are at least the best possible people, and not people that have knee-jerk responses. We can no longer afford the kinds of phrases that we've been dealing with in the past. We can no longer brushstroke entire populations of people and try to create or recreate a black and white world. It simply isn't going to work. We've got to become more self-critical. We've got to deal with these dicey situations, and we have to learn to be more independent-minded and not simply listen to some of our allies who are interested and driven primarily by their national interest and try to convince us that support for authoritarian regimes is somehow going to pay off in the long term. It will pay off in the short term if they stay in, and if they're in on our watch and then we move on. But the real question is, what's the long term going to look like? Not only for the populations there, but for American interests in the world. Thank you.
thank you to Dr. Esposito for a very, very invigorating talk. And we have 25 minutes for questions. My name is Donna Lee Docks. I'm the director of the Religious Studies Interdisciplinary Minor in the College of Liberal Arts. And Dr. Rebecca Hankins is in Cushing Library, who introduced Dr. Esposito, just so you know who all the players are. At any rate, with a group this large, there will be many questions. I will try to scope out, and I know I won't be able to choose everyone, but if you raise your hands if you have a question, and I'll begin. You begin now. The floor is open. Yes, sir, in the back.
Howdy. My question is regarding specifically Muslim American. Would you agree with the statement that oftentimes many individuals in the United States have become desensitized to the civil rights infringements in the U.S. towards Muslim Americans? And if so, what would you believe is causing that?
I mean, first, did everybody hear the question? Do I believe that many Americans become desensitized to the problems that some Muslim Americans or many Muslim Americans face with regard to civil liberties? What do I see the causes of it? It's an excellent question, and it's a significant question, and it is connected also to the international side. You know, sometimes we just try to separate the two. When Americans are asked, what do you admire about Islam and Muslims? 54 to 57% say nothing, or I don't know. Right? That's just the opposite of the so-called people who are anti-American, Arabs and Muslims over there, who actually talk about what they admire about us, and then talk about grievances, okay? The Park 51, the so-called building of a mosque, that brought the stats even more into relief. For the first time, I wrote a book called The Islamic Threat, Myth, or Reality after the first Gulf War in the early 1990s. And then I did a second edition towards the late 1990s. And in there I discussed Islamophobia in Europe and America. Very few people were talking about that. And we had Islamophobic articles out there. The New Republic, I think, had an article called The Muslims Are Coming, you know, etc. Okay? But for the first time after Park 51, a major publication, Time magazine, had a front cover that used the word Islamophobia. Never used. And it said, is America Islamophobic? If you read the article, and they just reported, it was very good reporting. It wasn't, you know, where somebody was just like an op-ed. But you'd be hard-pressed having read as they went around the country and looked at different incidents and talked to people that you wouldn't feel that it was Islamophobic. The stats that then even the Washington Post and others showed, the significant increase, the spiking even more of negative attitudes towards Islam and Muslims. The admission by significant numbers of Americans that they were twice as more biased when it came to Islam and Muslims, or likely to be, than they were towards people of other faith, towards Jews, etc. That stat's out there. The fact that after 9/11 and even to today, commentators can say in writing, in major publications, and on radio and television, let's just go over, convert, or kill them. The fact that they could say things like, as our major politicians, members of major political parties did in the last congressional elections, that Muslims who wanted to build an Islamic center, not so much a huge mosque, but an Islamic center, near, not at the site, were like Nazis who wanted to demonstrate outside the Holocaust Museum. A potential presidential candidate, Newt Gingrich, could say that. So we're not dealing, you see, in Europe, I can't move around, right, because of this camera. Okay, all right. Oh, jeez. I'm just not used to saying this. The fact that, in contrast to Europe, where you can see anti-immigrant attitudes, it's now seen in mainstream parties, but you could see it more boldly in Europe because you have anti-immigrant parties, new anti-immigrant parties in the last 10 years. So you've got a party that you can see in its platform is anti-immigrant and in many ways anti-Muslim, and you can see it in their leadership who make, you know, these statements. In the U.S., it's members of mainstream parties. It was members of Congress, people running for Congress, people running for governor, and it was potential presidential candidates in the last elections that were making these kinds of statements. For example, let's introduce legislation in South Carolina, in Tennessee, in Oklahoma, to ban Sharia law. Nobody's calling for Sharia law, but let's do a preemptive strike and ban it. And when we're asked what is Sharia law, well, it's about chopping off hands, it's about, beheading people, etc. Demonstrate that you really have no sense of what Sharia law is, the diversity of what that means. Okay? That, that for many Muslims, when they say Sharia, they're talking about a moral compass, okay? A moral code. Now, for Muslims like a bin Laden or for the Taliban, they engage in all kinds of actions in the name of Sharia law. But guess what? 56%, something like that, of Americans who believe that our legislation should be based on the Bible, right? And then there are some of those Christians who believe that they're so anti-abortion that you can blow up a clinic and kill people in it. Guess what? You have something called dominion theology. If you don't know what that is, you ought to, because it's part of our society. That reality's out there. So you got political commentators. You had during the Bush administration, this is not blaming the Bush administration, I'm talking about a time period here. You had hardline neocons. You had militant Christian Zionists. Not Christian Zionists. I'm not critiquing Christian Zionists. I'm criticizing militant Christian Zionists. Who do I mean? Not just Pat Robertson, John Hagee, Rod Parsley. Who were John Hagee and Rod Parsley? Great supporters of Mr. McCain. A Mr. McCain who didn't like the Christian right, but then decided he needed the Christian right. And who are Rod Parsley and John Hagee? They're people who actually had mega churches, had big TV programs, and they preach and write that Islam is evil, not extremist evil, that Muslims want to take over the world. And Mr. McCain did not back away from them. He only backed away from Hagee when it emerged that Hagee was anti-Catholic historically. And now you have a significant Catholic population to deal with. We bring in a lot of votes. And we, unfortunately, like a lot of successful people, I make political statements. Please don't be upset by them. But as we become more successful, what do? Like my youngest brother, we become a conservative Republican. So in other words, we count for a lot of votes. Now, am I implying that Newt Gingrich has become a Roman Catholic because he sees that profile there? He's got his normal base, and now you can add that big Catholic vote. I mean, if you look at the way Catholics vote, but that's part of a reality that's out there, and therefore that rhetoric is in the public square, and it's in our TV. People, it's part of our popular culture, and it's an accepted rhetoric. Kill them all and let Allah decide. It's a phrase that's been out there since 9/11. Discrimination in the workplace, civil liberties. And why would you blame the average American? Be honest with me. How many of you feel you can discuss really intelligently, in detail, the Patriot Act and the secret evidence? How many of you really feel confident? If a lot of you raise your hand, you're liars, because I don't even feel, and I'm a professional dealing with these things. Most Americans aren't even aware of what these are and how they've been used. Okay? Most Americans know that, for example, a major Muslim organization, there was major media coverage in Virginia, was that the homes of the leaders were raided. A couple of the leaders had their kids as my students. Okay, and hundreds of millions of dollars were expended in order to bring them to trial. The government dropped that case, said it could not move forward with it about 2 months ago. No media coverage. All the media occurred when it happened. So for most Americans have no idea of the thousands of people who were arrested after 9/11 and the fact that almost all of them were released. And the data's out there. If you look at my book, Future of Islam, you can go up and look up other people, okay? Most Americans aren't aware of FBI reports of bringing in 80,000 people and interviewing them, of going, what they're aware of are the terrorist attacks that have taken place here. It's not that they don't take place, but my point is, they don't have a context to put them within. And so, if you don't have the context, then you know about this community